Hello and welcome back to Everard Junction. So today I'm going to be carrying on with the scrapyard, and in the previous scrapyard video I'd pretty much finished the scene. Most of it was complete and I was just working on getting a few final details prepared and installed. I really enjoyed the process of making the scrapyard. I had a lot of fun with it. It was something a little bit different and it's become a little bit of a focal point on the layout. So after quite a bit of preparation, today I'm going to extend the scrapyard into almost double the size that it was. So as part of a much broader project that's behind the camera concerning changes to the town, I decided as part of that upgrade was to extend the scrapyard. As I said earlier, I really enjoyed making the scrapyard, and I think on a slightly bigger scale it will look quite a bit more impressive, and it will give me an opportunity to get a few more cars in there and work with white goods and things like that. I'd always wanted to put like a big pile of washing machines and ovens and stuff in here, and in the previous spot it was going to be a bit of a squeeze. So as you can see, I've taken the loose items out of the scrapyard, taken the fence down, and then expanded the scenery. So the canal has moved back to this location, which is probably about 150 mil further from where it was. It was originally here, running along the edge of where this where the brown sort of paint runs out. And I've also worked on changing up the retaining wall and stuff, and that will all be covered in a future video. But you can see the scrapyard now has an arch as part of its site. We've got a more convincing looking wing wall in there. I've extended the embankment, and we've also got a small space under the arch. Of course, the scrapyard or whatever business was here before, of course they were going to occupy that arch. It's very typical in the UK with railway arches, especially in places like London, for small businesses to occupy the arch and do business from those locations. So even if it's just part of a larger site, of course the business is going to make use of that available space. So now we have all of this space to expand the scrapyard. So let's get started. First thing is to work on the ground cover. Okay, this area is still a little bit too rough, so I'm just going to add some more sculpt mould. If you've not seen sculpt mould before, it's basically like plaster mixed up with paper. You just add some water into it and mix it up, and it's really handy for building up the terrain in certain areas. So as an example, back here, this section's got a roughly cut piece of foam to fill the gap between the existing embankment and the wall. And then to make it look much more natural, just come in with this sculpt mould and just build the area up. It's very, very thick. It's very handy for all sorts of bits and pieces, but I tend to use it for basically doing all of the ground cover on the layout. I've had various comments over the years when I've been using this stuff saying, oh, why don't you put the paint into the sculpt mould when you mix it? And I have tried that a couple of times, but have had very limited success with it. The problem is sculpt mould is white, and if you put the brown paint in, it just washes it out massively. I've also had problems with adhesion and things like that, and it can take forever for it to dry. It takes days for it to go off anyway, but with paint in it as well, sometimes it seems to take even longer. So I've just splashed a bit down here, just quick and dirty. The paint's still wet, as you can see, but it's only a small area. I think we'll get away with it. I'll smooth this out a little bit more, and then we'll paint over it, and then we can start working out where the rest of the details, things like that, are going to go. But typically I just put sculpt mould down neat and then leave it for about a week or so for it to dry. Okay, while the paint is drying, we're just reinstating the fence that I had previously on the scrapyard. This is a Goodwood Scenics kit. It's just a simple piece of corrugated aluminium and a steel wire fence, basically. Just cut it up, paint it to your liking and glue it together. And I must say, it does look very effective. It's one of my favourite parts of the scrapyard. Unfortunately, I was able to save it, so just gluing that back together. And here you can get a better look at the reconstructed canal. Still need to do a little bit of painting. I've made the canal piling myself this time, and it did take quite a few hours and was quite tedious, but I needed the canal piling to be flexible to go around this slight curve. Okay, so most of the fence is now installed. I'm just starting to work out where more bits and pieces are going to go. So I've had a bit of a rummage around in some boxes and stuff left over from old layout, things like that. Found these lovely caravans. So I'll do a bit more work to those. We'll get those positioned somewhere. Need a bit of moss growing on those. And then I've just found some more vehicles that will do the job quite nicely. So we've got an old Bedford truck, there's a Volvo 240, Mark 1 Escort van, Mark 1 Fiestas, Mark 1 and 3 Capri, Jaguar XJS, a Bedford CA van, and a Reliance Scimitar. So I think what I'll do is I'll put a wall running out this way. I'll use some I-beams and just put some like concrete slabs down through there, sort of separate this section off slightly. We'll leave this bit through here. Hopefully you can see on the camera as well, I've added a sort of a muddier area, so I've just run a couple of model cars through the sculpt mould as it was drying, and I'll add a little bit of gloss varnish and stuff in there, create some puddles, things like that, but just adds a little bit of interest. And of course this texture that's over here, that will of course continue into this area, but first I'll get the fences and things in and just sort of plan out where stuff is going to go. And of course I need to detail the ground that's going to go inside the archway just there. So I'll start putting the fence in. It's going to be a little bit difficult as I have sloped the terrain slightly. I'm not sure how well you can tell, but it drops about 10 mil, something like that. Just didn't want it, the scrapyard to be completely flat. Just create a little bit of interest in the terrain. So there we go, something a little bit like that. The infill pieces are just some offcuts from my previous kit that I just had lying around, and the I-beam posts are from Goodwood Scenics. So now I can focus on some of the smaller items, which will fill quite a large proportion of the scrapyard, sort of like a 50-50 split between cars and smaller things like engines or ovens, washing machines, and of course fridges. Could also have other sections for tyres and exhausts. So I think for this section I'll go for some appliances. That was the main goal with a whole section of the scrapyard, was to try and fill it full of white goods, things like that. Now these are 3D printed. 3D printed stuff in the hobby off the shelf can work out to be quite expensive. You can spend like £6-7 and get say 5 washing machines. Well, if you're doing a scrapyard, you want 30, 40, 50, 80, 100 washing machines. So it costs a lot of money. So fortunately my dad has got involved in 3D printing, so I asked if I could borrow his machine for a bit, and I designed these appliances on Tinkercad just quickly. They're nothing fancy, and printed them out. So I now have a nice collection of white goods washing machines, and they can just be tumbled about or organised neatly however you want. But for a first go, I'm quite pleased with how those have come out. Don't look too bad. So I'll give this wall a lick of paint, and then we'll come back with the appliances, and I'll make sure I weather some of them up as well, because they do look a little bit too clean. To avoid any brush strokes, I like painting this sort of stuff with a piece of foam, and for these particular ones I used two Vallejo colours, which is white grey and basalt grey, and I just used those in varying amounts to create the effect you see there. Okay, there we go. Something like that is probably what it'll end up looking like. That's just the washing machines and the ovens for the time being. There are some fridges, and I'll do a couple of other appliances as well, try and get some different models in there, because at the moment they're all the same, but maybe just these particular appliances were very popular in the town. Who knows? And they all broke at the same time. I have given them just a light wash with Vallejo German Grey, just to take the shine off of the white. Also obviously got to do all of these vehicles and rust them up and detail them. They're just literally just straight out of the box at the moment, or at least some of them are. So we'll sort those out, we'll sort the caravans out. Lots and lots of detail to add, but I am quite pleased with the appliances. That was the main sort of draw I wanted for this scrapyard. A couple of years ago I was at an exhibition and there was a small end-to-end layout that was basically a scrapyard in itself. The whole layout was a scrapyard. And in the scrap pile that was being lifted by the crane, you could see washing machines and appliances, and I saw that and I thought, well, that'd be a great thing to try and recreate. So happy with that. I've got some more of the fence posts, fence girders from Goodwood Scenics, and I've just glued those together to make some racking like that. And you can see I've left a little bit of the post sticking through the bottom, so I can drill a series of holes there and glue this in. But that fits really nicely in there along the back of that fence, and now I can come along and stack vehicles onto it. Something a little like that. Obviously I'll take the wheels off and detail the vehicles up, but it just, whilst adding vehicles to the scrapyard, keeps things looking a little more varied. So we've got a taste of all of the various things that you might have found in a scrapyard at this time. It's not based on any real place. I'm just looking at certain scrapyards from certain places in the country and going, oh, that's interesting, and trying to see if I can include it. So there'll be more vehicles around here anyway, scattered around, but I thought some racking back there would certainly look nice. And it certainly makes for a nice detail over the top of the fence. Makes the place look lovely. So I'm sure the residents of the neighbouring town will really appreciate the sight of scrap cars across the canal. Moving further down from the appliances, you can see I've just started to put another one of those walls up just to divide that section off, and this area I'm going to try and dedicate to mechanical components. So you can see we've got some stillage bins. That's a kit by Scale Model Scenery. When it's all painted up and detailed, it looks a little bit like that, and you can fill it with just about anything you like. In real life, you know, you put anything in there: alternators, water pumps, engine blocks, whatever you want. But these were very common back in the 80s, and they're still even a common sight today, and you can handle them with a forklift truck, so it's perfectly reasonable to put one on top of the other, a little bit like that. So we can create an area of interest in here, and I'll add some engine blocks and tyres and wheels and things like that. If you're doing a modern scene, you get these big metal roll-on, roll-off bins, if you like. You know, it's the whole size of a flatbed truck, basically, and they sort of replaced these, and you just had these big metal ribbed boxes, and you chuck all your tyres or engine blocks into those, and the truck will turn up and lift the thing onto itself and cart all that stuff away. So there's been a lot of changes since the 80s, but certainly something like this would be in keeping for what I'm modelling. I'll just touch up the ground cover a little bit. There's a few chips and things, and there's a couple of places where the coverage isn't as good as I would like, and then we'll move on and actually add the texture to the ground, and then start actually adding all of the various details. Okay, for the ground cover in the scrapyard, we're going to use a real mix of stuff, and we'll vary it in various places. So in some places we'll perhaps have just this, and in other places we'll have just that, and all sorts. So basically we've got very fine brown ballast, very dark colour. We've got some grey grout. I use this because it's really fine and it blends some of the areas together, and if you want to create the effect of some very old tarmac that's perhaps sort of buried beneath, or a hard packed surface, this is quite good for that. We've got some soil. This is just made by Javis. You buy it in bags. I just buy a bag of it and pour it into a container. And then we've got various scrap metal scatters from Goodwood Scenics, and you can see there's a mix of colours there, so we'll add bits of those in various places, try and create a bit of texture, and also match the previous bit that I've done on the other side of the scrapyard. Okay, so next thing, I'll just move some of this around a little bit with a dry, large paintbrush, just to create a few more effects. And of course, once I've glued all this down and it's dried, it'll then get airbrushed again, so it goes much darker and looks something like that. But you can see all of the different textures and bits and pieces in there, so it's basically the same thing. It's just obviously before it's been painted, it does look a bit vibrant. Okay, that's the sort of thing I'm looking for. You can see I've deliberately left the muddy section relatively bare from ground cover. I'll try and make that actually look like it's, you know, saturated and soaked, so I'll use a bit of lacquer. And you can also see I've created a few small bare patches, and these will be rainwater puddles, just to make things look that little bit more depressing. So I'll go ahead and spray this down with a 50-50 mix of white glue and water and leave that to dry. Okay, I'll leave that to dry for a couple of days and then we'll come back and continue. Okay, so this has now had enough time to dry. Actually dried a bit faster than I expected, despite being pretty cold outside, so the insulation in the loft is clearly doing its job. So the next thing to do is to paint this with some Vallejo black brown in my case. You can cover it with anything you want depending on what you're doing. We'll also come back and do the puddles as well, but you can see just by gluing it how much all of those scatter materials have darkened in colour, and how it's already starting to match the previous scenery over here that I have done in the past. So a little bit of airbrushing should get that blending quite nicely together. Okay, I shall leave that for a little while to dry. You can see there's lots of different colours going on in there, mostly grey, black and dark brown. It'll dull a little bit as it dries, and there's also still some of the original scatter colours showing through in there as well. I made sure I didn't, completely paint absolutely everything, so there are lots of variances in the colour and the texture. And once this is all covered in stuff, it should look pretty good. So now it's time to do the puddles, and for this I'm just going to use some gloss varnish. There are lots of different methods for doing this, but I'm just going to try out a bit of gloss varnish, as I don't need any depth to it. It just needs to be, you know, shallow. Doesn't matter how deep it is at all. Just needs to be a bit of a shine to show that there's some rainwater there. Okay, I've added the varnish. I used rail match, just standard rail match gloss varnish that I use for the locomotives. And as you can see, there's a few puddles in there, and I've also done some in the muddy section here with all the tyre tracks in it. So I'll leave that to dry, and I will probably have to reapply, do maybe a couple of coats, but we'll certainly get a shine on those sections, and it will look like, you know, there's rainwater or spilt fluids or whatever you want to imagine it to be, but it's going to look like a pretty stodgy, nasty place. Okay, so while the varnish dries, I'm just doing a little bit more work on the vehicles. Now, I'm modelling 00 scale in the UK, and most of the vehicles that we get are like this. They are die-cast. They are made of Mazak, so they are made of metal. So obviously you can appreciate removing panels is not exactly a walk in the park. Now I'm adding some more cars to the scrapyard. Really, we need some vehicles with some panels missing. So I've been busy with the drill and the files, and as you can see, I've removed the door from this Mark 1 Fiesta, and I've removed the bonnet and the door from that Mini Clubman. It's not a very easy process, and it is quite time consuming, sitting there with the drill and filing all of the shape out. In actual fact, getting the door off of that Mark 1 Fiesta was much more difficult and time consuming than taking the door off a real one. But I have made the effort with these 3 vehicles. Obviously I need to get the Capri finished, but we will have a few more in there with some missing panels. It's not going to be on every car because it just takes ages. Quite pleased with how that's all looking. So I've been building a couple of scale model scenery kits in the meantime. I've got some more of those stillage bins, and I've also built a couple of the skips. It's a handy little kit, and as you can see, I've filled the skips up with some more of the sort of cast scrap that I used in the previous video. I forget the name of the company that makes that stuff. It's at the bottom of the screen just there. But they're the people who, you know, they make the tyres, the wheels, all of the random pieces of assorted scrap. It comes pre-painted, as you can see. It looks a little bit bland, a little bit generic, and certainly those wheels are a little shiny. So once I've got everything in position, of course we'll go over that with a wash of a sort of black brown and just highlight some of those details and darken things down. And I'll also do a little bit more weathering to these stillage bins once everything's in position. Toned them down a little bit and painted them in a variety of colours. So we'll get those filled with various things, stack them up somewhere. I've also put together some workshop shelving, which I hope will sort of go in here in this little unit. I'm thinking perhaps this is where the guy who runs this place, you know, keeps the good stuff, or keeps a project he's working on, something, a classic car, something like that. So I'll go ahead and start laying out some of this detail, and I'll also reinstate a lot of the loose detail that was previously in the scrapyard that I removed when I extended the scene. So we'll get the engines back, and the tyres and the spare panels and bits and pieces. put lots of bits of detail down. So the next thing to do is to do various bits of painting. As you can see, those fresh pieces there look a bit strange. So lots and lots of painting to do, but you get the general idea. I've scattered things around a little bit and tried to make it look sort of organised chaos. Certainly different to the other side of the scrapyard. So I've stacked up the stillage bins in blocks of 2, placed the skips, pleased with those, and I've just dumped all of these engines onto some old tyres. Quite a common trick if you want to actually potentially use an engine in the future. Stick it on an old tyre, stops the sump and the bottom of the engine getting damaged on the ground. The appliances are back in position. I've still got more to add, a little bit of weathering required in there, but a nice contrast to the more sort of general industrial stuff here. And then we move into appliances. Everyone can relate to those, and I've put a skip behind the wall with some tyres, and then we've got an overflow as well just off to the side, and of course needs painting. And you can see it sort of stops here where we've got the track to get through to the cars and the unit at the back, and then we move back over to this side of the scrapyard that you're familiar with. So once we've got some cars over on this side, I think we'll get a nice balance. Okay, I've just applied washes to various bits and pieces. I actually used a pipette. It's fairly simple. All we did was just come in like that and just pour the wash, or apply the wash sparingly to the details, and it just tones things down, and it also, you know, weathers the sides of the stillage bins a little better. So I'll keep working on it. That's generally what I was doing. That will dry to a matte finish, so I'll keep working on it and come back a little bit later, perhaps apply a little bit more. So I've just added a small amount of diluted PVA glue to the area in a few select places, such as here. You can see I've applied a few bricks in a few places, just sort of, you know, a little bit more detail, a little bit more interest. So the next thing to do is to start adding the cars. We'll put those onto the rack, and I'll add the caravans and vehicles scattered around. We'll have 1 or 2 vehicles over here in this area, just to sort of blend things a little bit together, show that the place is a real mess. I had originally planned on putting the concrete sections into this bit of fencing here, similar to what I've done over here by the appliances, but I actually quite like the effect we got there with just the posts sticking out, nothing there at all. Could argue that, you know, they broke or they disintegrated, got taken out, or whatever, but it's just it's clearly redundant, but the posts are still in position. I quite like that. So I've put some of the cars in the racking over here at the back of the scrapyard, and you can see I've done a bit of work to some of those as well, finished those jobs that I was working on the workbench. So there's the Capri with the model of an engine in it, and yes, the engine is enormous, 3 litre Essex or 2.8 Cologne. Certainly not that big, but maybe it's a failed project, failed engine swap, something or other. If you're not interested in cars, it just looks like a car with an engine in it, so it serves its purpose. Got the Mini there with the missing door. You know, perhaps somebody needed a solid door for their Mini. Came to the scrapyard, saw that one, good condition. Undo a couple of bolts, job done. Got a burnt out Mark 1 Golf. I've got a Mark 1 Fiesta with a missing door, similar thing. Volvo 240 Estate. Old British Rail Escort van. British Rail, by the time my layout is set anyway, would have been using things like the Morris SL and the Bedford Astromax van, stuff like that. And then we've got a Mark 1 Capri and another Fiesta just hiding in the corner here. So certainly plenty of room for some more vehicles. So I have been busy on the workbench, and we've got some more ready to go. Here we have the two caravans pretty much ready to go, and as you can see I've applied a wash to those and really grimed them up, and I've also gone over them, a little bit of an experiment, gone over them with a very dark green wash, very thinly applied, just to some of the detail to create a light mould. It's a caravan. Usually you see a caravan finished in light mould if it's been sat for a while, so they should look the part. I'm not exactly sure who makes these models. I've had them in my collection for years, and underneath it just says caravan. Doesn't say anything about the maker or anything like that, but they are a nice model. If you see a model of a caravan that looks like this, I would recommend it. Here we've got a Bedford CA, and I've just patched up some of the paintwork you can see with a bit of red here and there, and then applied the usual rust and weathering to that van. I've also flattened the tyres, just cut off a bit of the bottom of the tyre with a sharp knife, as this would have been sat in the yard for some time. These rusted unbelievably quickly, so to see one in that condition in the late 80s, quite normal. And for a bit of commercial action, there you go, we've got an old Bedford Arctic, it's probably a TK or something from that family anyway. These rusted unbelievably quickly as well, so to see an ex-British Rail one in that sort of condition, quite typical by 1989. So we'll put the truck just there. We've got some scrap obviously starting to pile up to the edge of it, and we'll put some stuff around it as well. It's near these puddles, should make for a good scene looking across at the truck. Dump the caravans over there. So hopefully you can see the green just there, the light mould, and or heavy mould around the windows certainly. A little bit of an experiment, I think it's worked. And this is the latest round of MOT failures. I've got a Mark 1 Escort, failed its MOT. Got a Vauxhall Viva, I think there's a HC, HB, I'm not so good with my older Vauxhalls. Mark 2 Escort, and a Hillman Imp. I actually quite like the Hillman Imp, but they all rusted away, so here it is in the scrapyard. So you can see I've painted some of the panels on the Mark 1 Escort and the Viva. Very typical. 20, 30, 40 years ago, this is what you did. If the door was rusted, you go to the scrapyard and you get a better one, and you would bolt it on. If you had a little bit of extra money, you might have gone and bought some paint and sprayed it up against the garden wall, but typically you saw a lot of cars with mismatched panels. The Mark 1 and the Mark 2 Escort are some of the newer cars from Oxford Diecast. I don't think they've been out too long, and I purchased these specifically to put into the scrapyard, which is a little bit of a shame, so I purchased two more in different colours to have on the street elsewhere on the layout. So I'll go and sort out the static grass and a few bushes and things, maybe the odd small sapling, tiny tree, that type of thing, for that spot there. Bit of undergrowth certainly needed. I'll have a think about what to do under the arch. I'm just basically going to make a small piece of card, false floor, decide what sort of scene it's going to be, just slide it into position. So that shouldn't be too difficult, and then I can carry on expanding the detail further past the canal to the left of the camera. But this bit is certainly looking a lot better than it was. Okay, so it's been a few days and I've made a little bit more progress, and I'm quite pleased with the scene now. We're starting to reach a point where I can leave it and come back in the future and add small extra bits and pieces of detail, but the main part of the project is done. Very pleased with how it's looking. Now I can move on to something else. So as you can see, I've added some ground cover in the form of static grass and a few small saplings and bushes, a couple of buddleia plants as well, just to blend the bare bit of embankment into the original bit. And you can just about tell where the join is, but it's not particularly noticeable, and I can add a few more shrubs and things to better hide that in future. if we move down into the scrapyard itself, I've just added a few bits of sea foam, and I've not applied any foliage or anything to it. I've just left it bare to sort of look like, you know, some dead bushes or very small weeds and saplings that are just starting to grow between the cars in this older section of the scrapyard. Most of the small details and things like the drums and spare tyres and traffic cones and things like that have now been glued down with a very small amount of diluted PVA glue, and that will just allow me to better dust and clean this area in future. Shouldn't be too bad. Hopefully we won't lose too much detail over the coming years. So most of that's all glued down now. Quite a few of the vehicles are loose, so I can move them around just to create different scenes, and hopefully over the course of the next several videos, if the scrapyard appears, you might see some of the vehicles and figures moving around. So at the moment we've got the forklift truck on his way with that Mark 1 Golf to place it into the storage rack over there. I've done some detail over in the archway, and apologies for not filming it, but obviously you can appreciate doing the detail was going to be quite tricky, and all you were going to see was the back of my hand. So it's not finished in there yet, but you get the idea. We've got an old Triumph Roadster and a Mercedes 190 SL. They would have been somewhat sought after during the 80s. So this is where the guy who runs this place keeps the good stuff. And you can see I've put some covers over the cars at jaunty angles, so you can see what the car is, but you can also see that, you know, there's a cover over it. And that's really easy to do. That's just a small piece of toilet paper, put it over the car, and just paint it with some very, very thin diluted paint with a paintbrush. The toilet paper will absorb the paint, go very soggy, and conform to the shape of the car. And then once it's dried, you can simply place it on the scene on the layout, and you've got the effect of a car under a tarpaulin or a cover. Small bit of concrete or hard standing in there as well, and I've just blended that into the existing ground cover with a little bit of Deluxe Materials fine filler, and then painted it accordingly. You can also see those workshop shelves from Scale Model Scenery to the left. Those are not glued down, they're just in there loosely, same with the cars, so I can add some more detail to this section in future. But certainly at a glance, it looks quite a bit better than the previous shots in this video, where it was just a piece of foam and nothing else. So you've probably noticed the forklift truck in the background in quite a few of the shots in this video. This is also made by Oxford Diecast, like many of the vehicles that are actually in the scrapyard, and it's a model of a Shelvoke and Drury freight lifter, which is quite a heavy-duty forklift truck. I wanted to have a vehicle, obviously, for loading and unloading stuff in the scrapyard. It was always the original intention. But a traditional, small forklift truck for handling pallets, although it's perfectly capable of lifting up a car, it just felt it was a little bit small, not particularly interesting. And bigger stuff like an old dragline crane or something like that that's been repurposed for handling scrap material, that was a little bit too big. The jib of the crane would have rather dominated the scrapyard scene. So I went for the Oxford Diecast model of the freight lifter. It's sort of a little bit of both. It's a large enough vehicle that it stands out, but it's not so small that it just gets lost in all the other details. That is not the colour that it comes in. It comes in various colours. I bought the British Rail yellow one and simply took it apart and repainted it in Rail Match Equipment orange. I thought that was quite a nice colour for a sort of freight handling piece of equipment. I made sure I masked up the wasp stripes on the back of the forklift truck, as I certainly wasn't going to bother trying to redo those, although you can get transfers and stuff. So I just masked that up, left it as it is, and repainted the rest of the model and applied weathering, rust, washes and things like that. So perhaps it looks a little bit like bought it second hand and then refurbished it with a tin of orange paint. So that's the forklift truck, and it will be in various positions around the scrapyard over the videos to follow this one. I'll wait for the rest of the ground cover to dry and get some people and other little bits and pieces prepared for the scene, and then I think we'll call that quits for this video and we'll leave it there. It's by no means finished, and I'll come back and add various things in the future. I've left space in the scrapyard to allow for that, but I'm really pleased with how this has come out. I can leave it be for a while and go away and do something else. Okay, so I've done a couple more bits and tidied up all of the mess, got the trains back up and running, and I think we'll leave it there. I'm quite pleased with how things are looking, and as I've said a couple of times, can always add stuff, can always come back to it, but for the moment, that looks fine. Now I'm going to move on to another project. So I've painted up a few more figures and just added them around the yard in a few places, and I've also added a little bit of litter, and I'll come back and add some more in the future, I'm sure. You can see there's a couple of newspapers and things strewn about the place. Those are made by Scale Model Scenery. Just cut them out, glue them down, and then we've got a couple more figures over here as well, working on these cars. There's just little things like that. You can see there's another newspaper just down there. Got the latest customer over here. It's just pushed his Mini from the local garage. Probably just failed its MOT, so only a short push, luckily. I'm sure we'll have some space for that. And I've just added a few more newspapers and random bits of litter. Just generally around the place, but we'll come back and add more in the future. We've also got some site security. Just started his first day, and I'll get some of that really fine jewellery chain, see if we can get a chain, tie him up somewhere. But at the moment he's just running loose around the yard, frightening everybody that comes in. But again, nice bit of detail, very typical for a scrapyard at this time. And then over here we've got the night shift. He's just relieving himself on that traffic cone. So there you go. Hope you enjoyed the video. Perhaps picked up a couple of ideas from it. I certainly enjoyed doing this project. Lots and lots of detail. It's only a small area, but you can really have a lot of fun with it. A lot of different techniques, a lot of effects. So I'll leave it there, and I'll move on to the next project. And I'll leave you with a couple of shots, of course, of the trains running past this scene. It's not complete, but it's pretty close. I'm happy with how that has come out.